Kia ora and welcome to my presentation today, Teaching Colonisation to Pākehā Without Provoking Backlash. My name is Allan McEvoy. I am a lecturer at Unitec Institute of Technology in Auckland. I teach on both the Bachelor's and the Level 4 New Zealand Certificate programs. And today I want to share with you how we've gone about actually addressing what some refer to as white fragility. I could probably think of a few other names, but yeah, that sense within often Pakiha communities when they first hear the history of Aotearoa in terms of the colonisation processes that occurred post-Treaty of Waitangi, and the sense of guilt and shame and uncertainty that often accompanies them becoming aware of this information about our history, and the touch points for them within that around thinking about their own tupuna, their own ancestry, and how this fits in. So recognising the struggles that have come for some students and taking this on board, we have looked at how we could present this in a way that allows everybody to become part of it and be within it. So there's 5 different points that we touch on essentially. We take students into a much wider context of historical elements that feed into the colonisation process that preceded it and have drawn it along. So it's a much wider context of human behaviour and historical influences. We invite people very much to learn and be part of this, to be part of change also, to be aware of the fact that we in Aotearoa, New Zealand, have a unique opportunity perhaps to address some of the issues that are still with us from this process of colonisation that occurred and how it's evolved to where it is now. We attempt within that to remove shame and guilt, and often the context of our own experiences, this is the lecturers, which I will come to as we move through, being able to share that information, being able to share the fact that we only know what we know when we find it out. So myself and my co-teacher, we talk about the fact that neither of us had any idea of much of the real history, the outside of the Biggles version of history of Aotearoa New Zealand, until we reach tertiary level. And that's where our students are at right now. So there's no need to feel shame about the fact you do not know this material prior to coming here. We also share stories. We found stories are really important and vital in terms of illustrating what we're talking about and actually bringing students on board to give them greater understanding. So those are the principal things that underlie how we go about this. So on top of talking to you about what we teach, I have also done some research with students, Pakiha students who've been through this program, and tried to identify what has worked and what has maybe not been so great. So that's the stuff I'm going to share with you this morning. We began with blah, 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 blah. So moving immediately into where we begin this class. So we're looking at what Pakiha actually know when they come into the class, because this underpins a lot of the reaction that is found among Pakiha students. So in the research that I did with the group of students who'd been through our course, when we looked at what they knew prior, here's some quotes from the feedback that we received, but the overall impression was very little or nothing. Stuff around the fact the Treaty of Waitangi had been signed, but very little known about the Māori Wars. Certainly nothing on a great level prior to the colonisation processes and the Treaty of Waitangi. Remembering learning things like Maui legends in primary school. I particularly like that quote. I learned my history from Braveheart. So students speaking to the fact that most of what they had learned in terms of history came from mass media, came from very Europeanized or Americanized contexts that were played out in movie versions of history. And there was this lack of understanding about what all the fuss was about and why does this really impact on me? I'm Pakiha, I'm not Māori. So, and this is obviously coming from a place of ignorance and unknowing, which our education systems have supported and created really, and then maintained throughout Aotearoa's history until very recently. So moving on to what we teach and how we teach. We teach the course over 2 days. We've expanded it out rather than just trying to cram it all into one day, which originally was in the module that we inherited. Myself as Pakiha and a co-teacher who is tangata whenua, we teach and we very much come into the position as partners. is. And then we identify and position ourselves first and foremost. So we'll move on to that now. So within positioning ourselves, we very much talk to the fact that we are who we are because of the colonisation of Aotearoa and the positions that we hold. We speak to those very clearly. So within speaking for myself here and the part that I play in this, I speak to my own privilege and the complexities around that, talking around the elements of white privilege that make it so hard to see for those who are actually living in it and being part of it. Perhaps the fish not recognizing the water that it swims in because it's this natural environment type of thing. But also, when you are talking to this stuff, we explain layers of privilege and the layers of hierarchy that go within, say, for example, the white privilege experience or male privilege, where if you are surrounded by people that actually you identify as being above you or having more privilege than you or having more benefits from the society that we live in than you, then you're not necessarily going to be looking down and noticing those who are experiencing less than you've got, and instead you feel that you are hard done by, and not understanding also the concepts of institutionalized racism that do not affect you if you are not part of the subjugated or smaller group. So within this as well, to really place ourselves clearly where we are, I speak to stories of my Pakiha, tupuna and Aotearoa and the complexities around that, breaking down that this is not a very simplistic thing of all good or all negative. And within that, I speak to the fact that, one of my tupuna was killed while surveying in disputed lands that the local iwi had very clearly said they were not giving up, they were not selling off, and he was part of a group of Pakiha armed who went in and just continued with this colonisation process or trying to take the land. And I also had the tupuna who came and immediately arriving in Aotearoa, who went and lived with the local iwi in the area that he was and learned to grow food with them, learn their customs, etc. And became quite pivotal in trading food between where the gardens were that Māori had food provision in, and across the harbour or across the bay to where the local colonised settlement was. And he, to all intents and purposes, when you hear the stories of him being involved in that, he sounds like he was a sensitive New Age guy for his time. However, he also, when he returned, I guess, to a more Pakiha way of living and married my great-grandmother and raised a family of his own, returned to quite an angry, violent form of parenting. The hot Irish temper, as they called it, or fiery Irish temper came out of him, and his way of parenting continued a cycle of violent parenting, violence towards children in terms of discipline that continued right through to my generation. So, while he was doing some amazing things on one area, in terms of his immigration and engaging with the local population, as it was the tangata whenua who were here, he also carried with him a whole bunch of things that weren't so great. So, and again, I can't go into all the detail of the stories that I share here, but this really puts a context and an understanding, we believe, for the students of the fact we cannot just align one or the other as good or not so good. So moving into the content that we teach, okay, so on day one, we really have a focus on a broader historical context around this. So we go back to talking about human interactions, conflicts, etc., right through history. We go back to talking about changes in technology, everything from the first groups of humans who adapted the horse as a form of military weaponized the horse, you could say, and the differences that made, right through to the invention of gunpowder, etc., and firearms, and the difference that technology made, and essentially how, when we look at human history over a long period of time, those who gain the greater technology often have used that to then subjugate others or take resources from others. We also talk about the history of conquest and colonisation throughout history again, and we go back using two examples predominantly: the Holy Land, which most people are aware of, so modern Israel, the occupied territories, but we go right back to the Canaanite and pre-Canaanite times and the different groups of population that have come in and lived there, taken the land over, the conquests that have occurred, the colonisation processes that have occurred there. Familiarise people with the concept that this is a larger than Aotearoa situation. We also talk to Britain, or England as it was, and we go right back to the time of the ancient Britons or the Picts, who were in what is modern day Scotland, and how those populations were conquered, captured, colonised, and then going through the history of the different colonisation processes that took place in what we refer to today as England, up until 1066 with the Norman conquest and the colonisation process that put on there. So we're developing a much larger context here around what we're discussing and talking about. So after having spent some time going through the historical processes and putting context into it, we then break the students into group and ask them to go and research a nation that has been colonised in modern times. And they are then required to come back and actually share this with the class, do a presentation on it. So they have a bit of time, they have several hours to do this. And you can see the list of countries named there on my slide. The USA, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc. Very, very clearly students understand that these places have been colonised, but the inclusion of Ireland and Scotland there often is surprising to our students. But when we go back and they take a look at that process, and we think it's very important that they do, to understand that what we refer to as Britain nowadays came about through colonisation processes, and looking at the history of that, how it occurred several hundred years and over long periods of time, but certainly several hundred years before the colonisation of Aotearoa. And you can see the questions we ask students to go in and look at there. And when students come back and we do those presentations, it's just amazing how the sense of engagement that we gain from students at this point, and we speak then to the common impacts of colonised people and the colonising people, actually, the impact upon resource control, how that flows on through to who gains access to what and the privilege that's created from that. And we look at examples around the world of different behaviour patterns, especially we speak to often at this stage of the day around the impact on the Indigenous populations of the 4 countries of the world that were colonised and remain ruled, governed by the colonising powers, if you like. So they being the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, 4 countries that were deeply colonised and where the colonising peoples have remained. The nations have never, or the Indigenous populations have never gained independent control and sovereignty back over their resources and their nation, their country, their whenua, on a nationwide scale. And we also come into talking from that often around neocolonialism, even down to looking at what is going on today in the world of the European space, where the nations of the Western European, or formerly referred to as Western European nations, operate in terms of an economic colonisation or an economic benefit from the Eastern European nations. And we speak to the resource extraction and how investment goes in and where the gain from investments go. So we continue to take this through into a space where, again, students are seeing it in a much wider global context. We come into day 2, we just touch back on some of the technology advancements, etc., especially in weaponry, blah, blah, and the drive around the age of exploration. So then we come into the arrival of Europeans in Aotearoa. We talk about who came, what they brought, what has changed, what was changed in that context because of this. And we go really from 1769, when Cook was here, as opposed to Abel Tasman, etc. And from Cook's time, we speak to the whalers, the sealers, those groups that first came through here prior to the missionaries, and then the first group of missionaries coming in as well. From here, we go into teaching around the Declaration of Independence and the things that led up to that. And most of our students, again, have not heard of the Declaration of Independence, or if they have, it's very recent and they don't really know anything about it. But by far, the majority have never heard of it. We then go into the Treaty of Waitangi. What, why, how, whom was involved, etc. And what it promised, what the two versions are, and what Māori, the tangata whenua of Aotearoa, were expecting and believing they were signing up to. And from there, we look at how the promises perhaps or the commitments made were undermined by settler governments and the laws that were brought in. Again, we take the students here, we get them to do the research for themselves and to go out and look at this rather than just feeding it to them. They are aligned, or sorry, they are given, a piece of legislation, and they're asked to go and do some research into that piece of legislation and looking at where the principles of Ti Tiriti are breached by that legislation. So, the first piece of legislation is 1852. It goes right through to the Suppression of Rebellion Act, Taonga Suppression Act. We might have been, I think we got to the 1953 Māori Affairs Act. So it covers quite a range of legislation and timeframes, and it allows students to actually go and do this research themselves and bring it back to the class once again and present it. So by the time we are at the conclusion of day 2, we have been fully discussing, there's a massive kōrero going on around the ongoing impacts for colonised people, and again, and those who have been doing the colonising, and the impacts that has around resource control and the ongoing drive from that, of course. So, and I put in their drive to honour the treaty, and we do speak to that, and we speak very much at this point as well, bringing them back to the reminder that they've been invited into learning this information and gaining this knowledge with the hope that they will become part of the transition process that actually allows Aotearoa perhaps to lead the world in actually rectifying some of the damaging impacts of colonisation. And of course, we predominantly do speak to the damage and impacts on the whenua, the colonised peoples in these areas, but we also look at how this has impacted and privileged those who came in from the colonising powers, and therefore what our responsibility is, I guess, in terms of what we do with this information now we have it. Now, I certainly speak to the fact of my privilege, as I mentioned earlier, the apex that I sit at within that space as a middle-class white male. Now, I may not have always been those things, but in terms of middle class, but I am probably firmly entrenched in that space in my life now. So speaking to that, acknowledging it, and very much sharing that I feel no guilt for the position that I've ended in by the accident of birth. I feel no shame for what my ancestors did, which is often what students say they experience. Even when we're talking through this, they'll go through that process. And I feel no guilt or no shame because, of course, I did not do these things. They were done much prior to my time. However, what I do now have, and I speak to this clearly to the class, is a responsibility. Now that we have this information and this knowledge, what are we going to do with it? The widow goes out, the challenge goes out to our students. What are we going to do with it? And the invite goes out to say, let's join together and work with, join with all tauiwi who come into Aotearoa, with the point of actually aiming to rectify the injustices of the past and bring about much more just outcomes for the future. So, I speak to the fact that what I'm doing with this is I'm being part of conversations. I'm standing up for the rights of tangata whenua, acknowledging the breaches that occurred and trying to spread the knowledge and the word of this. But also at the same time, we look at how else can we help? What else can we get involved in? We speak to some of those things as well. Again, inviting students to become involved in that. And we then, generally have quite a good outcome from these classes. I'm not going to say that everybody is transformed fully, shall we say, in terms of attitudes and worldviews. However, we went through this process of doing research with some of our students, and this is what I'll speak to now. And of course, what Pakiha felt. We know from the original slide I showed you that when they came in, many of them knew nothing. And so they did go through this process of, feeling ashamed, shocked, embarrassed. My grandparents did this. And flowing on from that, there were times when students started to feel that they were blamed or victimized or felt bashed at times and unsafe. like they were a little bit scared to talk out about things and felt that there was this attack on Pakiha. Some of them still did feel that, despite the fact we were trying to make it as safe an environment to have that conversation as possible. And that is something that we talked to, and I guess we felt that we do address really strongly, and we speak to this fact that you don't need to feel shame. We put it into the wider context. And we also talk to the fact that we're talking about British or English colonisation, Pakiha colonisation in Aotearoa, because we are in Aotearoa. The fact that, if we were in the Congo, we'd be speaking about Belgian colonisation and prior to that Portuguese. Despite all of that stuff I want to touch on here, students still feel this sense of shock, shame, and uncertainty. It still rose within them during the course of our exploration of this material. And moving on, as I said, the end of the course, most of the students, the majority by far, speak to us of feeling comfortable and much, much better about this stuff. So what has actually worked? And we have here some of the responses. Having the two lecturers come in as Ti Tiriti partners was very helpful and recognised. Our sharing out, the stories we shared, the facts we made I statements, and that we spoke to the fact of our privilege, how we'd come to move beyond shame. Created a space where the students actually felt that they were being enlightened here. And there were comments around we being made to feel safe. However, as you can see there also, one student did say they felt they still couldn't win. So what did they mean by that? They were talking to the fact that they still felt a little scared to say anything. So again, as I said, we're not saying everybody responds in the same way to this, but overall, the general gist, probably I would say, I need to do my checking on my numbers with this and bang it out, but it would be like a 90% response rate of this was a really safe place. And by the end of it, there was strong recognition that taking it into, for the two of us, Ania and myself, Ti Tiriti partners, take it into the much larger context did make it easier. It felt that they could relax. Well, I like that quote there. I felt my shoulders relax a little bit. And you could almost see that sometimes with students, the anticipation of what's coming and the tenseness within their body language, and then it's sliding out and moving. And so it was really good to hear these students saying that what we were doing was actually working for them, even though there were times when it was uncomfortable. No one was denying that, but it certainly was made much more comfortable. And the defensiveness dropped away. We did not end up having what I've seen in the past, which is separation within a classroom or defensiveness occurring. And I must say that our tangata whenua students are very, very gracious, often because they knew a lot of this stuff already. It's the Pakiha students who it's a real surprise to. And our tangata whenua students were very supportive and very cool in the way that they responded. Was there a sense of anger from some tangata whenua when they were learning this? Because some of them were learning it anew. And yes, we can't step away from that. But when we look at it and we put it into context and we understand it, then everybody in the room is aware of the fact that this is the case. I mean, I speak to the fact as well that had I been tangata whenua, had I learned this information as a young tangata whenua male, I would have gone down an angry path. I'm pretty sure, as an older, more mature person, of course, we gain insight and the ability to step back and look at this in a larger context, etc. But my initial response would have been one of intense anger, because injustice, and what we're talking about here is injustice, really pushes my buttons. And students again responded to the fact that they felt it was really, really helpful to have lecturers who would get up there and speak to what they felt, how they felt it, when they felt it, why they felt it, and I guess how we've been able to move on from that into a more positive space.